appreciate you joining us again, Another Chance Church. Unfortunately, we missed last week. Ever since we started this, it just seems like there has been something attacking our family, our household, illness, and technical difficulties and whatever. We apologize for missing. We're back this week. Might be a long one. We might end up splitting this one into a couple. I'm not sure yet. I don't know how long this is going to take. But we are going to continue with the major speeches of Jesus in Matthew. But before we get into that, number one, I want to point out we're probably going to have some sound issues this week because we are out in the middle of a Corvette and classic car show this weekend, which is awesome because that means there's going to be a lot more people out walking around, potentially seeing and hearing what we're doing. So that's great. And also, it's a community event. It's just always great. It's always nice to see the community come together and do something. So just bear in mind, we're just going to power through. Hopefully you can hear everything, but normally it gets loud. I'm going to stop and try to give it a chance. It's probably going to be loud the whole time this time, so we're just going to power through. Also, wanted to just give everybody the heads up. Pay attention over the next couple of weeks. There are some announcements coming. I'm not going to divulge yet, but some exciting stuff coming, some changes to things, and we're just excited about it and want to share it with you as things develop. Beyond that, I'm going to ask my wife to come pray for the service, and we're going to jump in because there's a lot to cover today.
Dear Lord, thank you for gathering us here today. Please be with us during this service. Please let your words be heard, and please be with all those who are here for this community event to get here and then back home again safely. Thank you and amen.
Okay, so when we came out on the streets, back in January, I guess, and it's April now, so wow. We started with the Sermon on the Mount, which we spent several weeks on, and that just kind of evolved into talking about the 5 major speeches that are recorded that Jesus gave in Matthew. Matthew is really centered around these 5 speeches, and then the parts in between are just kind of, I'm losing my word here, but I don't want to say filler because it's all important, but they just kind of set up what happened in between and show the different parts of Jesus' ministry, but he really focuses on these 5 speeches. So this is the third of those, and it is called commonly the Parabolic Discourse, which sounds very complicated, and it's not. Parabolic, it's just saying this is a recording of many of Jesus' parables. This one is unique in that the writing is a little ambiguous about it. This may or may not have all happened in one setting, it's not really. I'm not really sure. Just the way that it works, it could have all been at one time. It could have been a situation where Jesus talks for a minute and then comes back to let everybody discuss or something, and then comes back. Or it may be a series of stories that he told throughout his ministry that Matthew just collected all right here because he does talk at one point about that Jesus always spoke in parables, and so I'm not real sure. I'm not getting into that. I don't think it really makes any difference to the scripture whether it all happened at once or whether it's a bunch of stories conglomerated. It's just, I don't know if I use that word right, but this is one of my favorites because I love the parables of Jesus. I love the fact that he takes ideas and important information and puts it in language that anyone of the day would have understood. Although that doesn't mean they understand the point that he's making. We'll get into that as we go through. So we're starting in Matthew 13. If you want to follow along, I'll give you just a second. I'll ramble for just a second so you can turn there or get there on your phone or whatever. pardon me. But in Matthew 13, we're just going to go through the whole chapter. So starting in verse 1, it says, later that same day, Jesus left the house and sat beside the lake. A large, sorry, I put this in a font that I may regret. A large crowd soon gathered around him, so he got into a boat. Then he sat there and taught as the people, pardon me, as the people stood on the shore. He told many stories in the form of parables, such as this one. Listen, a farmer went out to plant some seeds. He scattered them across his field. Some seeds fell on the footpath, and the birds came and ate them. Other seeds fell on the shallow soil with underlying rock. The seeds sprouted quickly because the soil was shallow, but the plants soon wilted under the hot sun, and since they did not have deep roots, they died. Other seeds fell among thorns and grew among the thorns that grew up and choked out the tender plants. Still other seeds fell on fertile soil, and they produced a crop that was 30, 60, and even 100 times as much as had been planted. Anyone with ears to hear should listen and understand. His disciples came and asked him, why do you use parables when you talk to the people? He replied, you are permitted to understand the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but others are not. To those who listen to my teaching, more understanding will be given, and they will have an abundance of knowledge. But for those who are not listening, even what little understanding they have will be taken away from them. That is truly, pardon me, that is why I use parables. Sorry, this might be a little rough because I thought this is a pretty font. And it's all scripted and cursive, and I'm paying for that now. My old eyes are not making it out as well as I thought they would. Sorry, let's go back to verse 13. He says, that is why I use parables. For they look, but they don't really see. They hear, but they don't really listen or understand. Now, I want to stop here real quick. Have you ever talked to someone and you could see in their face that they weren't actually listening to you? They were just waiting for their opportunity to jump in and refute what you're saying. They were just looking for certain keywords so that they could, so they could build their. I mean, you can literally see that they're building an argument in their head while you're talking to them, rather than listen to what you have to say. And you can usually tell that because when you finish, when they get the opportunity to jump in and rebut, oftentimes they don't even respond to the point that you're making. And I think that's part of what Jesus is saying here is those who aren't really listening, those who aren't really trying to understand what I'm saying, they're not actually going to get anything from it. And really, they're going to come back and retort and make no sense because they're not listening. They're not trying to understand what I'm saying. A mark of a good listener, and I battle with this because I'm a fixer. I am a guy who I want to hear what your problem is, and then I want to try to fix it. I'm not one of those guys who's real good at just letting someone vent to let them vent. Even though I do that, I do that. I don't want anybody to try to fix my stuff, but I want to fix everybody else. It's a sickness, I guess. But you can tell when someone is so busy trying to fix or correct that they're not really listening to what you had to say. And then oftentimes they'll reply with something that just doesn't make any sense to the situation because they didn't really understand what you were getting at. One mark of a good listener is, number one, you can see that they're engaged in hearing what you're saying. Number two, when you get to the end of your point, if you are wanting them to respond, when you get to the end of your point, then oftentimes they're going to stop for a minute. There's going to be a pause there because They're going to listen to everything you said. Then they're going to take a second and process it and be like, okay, so this is a major point, this is what happened, and these are the things, and okay. And then they're going to start to respond, and then they're going to start to maybe even ask more questions and get more clarification, but you're going to see that they're actually listening to you because their response is going to make sense to what you said. Or sometimes you talk to somebody and you can just see that they are just totally not there at all. I mean, they're sitting there and they're maybe facing you, but you're talking to them and they're just kind of off in the clouds, and or these days, yeah, okay, yeah, for sure, and they don't know anything that you said. Now, I tend to scroll my phone a lot, so that's something else I battle with a lot too. But a lot of times, I'm not defending it. It's actually kind of rude, and you shouldn't do that to people. But a lot of times, even though I'm sitting there scrolling my phone, I know what's going on. And sometimes I'll surprise my wife because I'll be scrolling something and she'll start talking to me, and then she'll throw in something, left field to try to gauge whether I'm listening or not. And then I'll go back and I'll repeat the 2 or 3 points that she just said before the crazy off the wall thing, and she's like, okay, he was listening. Other times, she will ask me a question and stop talking, and there will be a long, awkward pause, and then I'll be like, oh, what? I'm going to put that down now because I'm not really multitasking well. And it's an illness that we've all got to some degree because of these things that we have. I'm not bagging on technology. It's a great tool, but we all tend to misuse it. Not the point I'm making, though. The point I'm making here is Jesus is saying, if you're interested in what I'm saying, if you really want to know what it is I'm trying to tell you, and you tune in and listen, you're going to get what I'm saying. If your point, or if your purpose is to argue and to try to shoot holes in what I'm saying, you're not really going to hear what I'm saying. You're just going to sit there and try to pull keywords and build arguments, and you're not going to get what I'm saying. And if you're not really interested in hearing me, but you're not really interested in arguing, you're just kind of here because whatever, you're going to tune out and you're not going to get it anyway. You might pick up a little here and a little bit there, but you're not really going to understand what I'm saying. And then this is something that I notice a lot, is even when I am paying attention, because my memory is getting, the way it is. I'm getting older. Is there's a lot of times I'll have a conversation with somebody, or I'll be in a situation and I'm really paying attention, but then a couple days later I'm thinking back about that situation and I'm kind of like, I don't know if, and I don't remember details, and so it doesn't seem as powerful as it did in the moment or something like that. But that happens to me sometimes even when I am engaged in paying attention. So Jesus is saying, if you don't bother to listen, if you can't be bothered to try to understand or to press in a little bit, you're not going to get it, and you're going to walk away, and even the points you did get are going to fade and not really make a whole lot of difference to you. So jumping back in at verse 14, he says, this fulfills the prophecy of Isaiah that says, when you hear what I say, you will not understand. When you see what I do, you will not comprehend. For the hearts of these people are hardened, and their ears cannot hear, and they have closed their eyes, so their eyes cannot see, and their ears cannot hear, and their hearts cannot understand, and they cannot turn to me and let me heal them. In verse 16, he goes on, he says, but blessed are your eyes because they see, and your ears because they hear. I tell you the truth, many prophets and righteous people longed to see what you see, but they didn't see it. And they longed to hear what you hear, but they didn't hear it. This kind of reminds me of the verse later in Isaiah, because he just cited Isaiah. Later in Isaiah, in verse 55, verse 6, I'm going to let the siren go for a second because that's intended to drown everything else out. So, later in Isaiah, verse 55, or chapter 55, verse 6, it says, "Seek the Lord while you can find Him; call on Him while He is near." See, what Jesus is saying is, you're not always going to have the opportunity to understand what I'm trying to tell you. You need to listen when I'm talking to you, because I'm not always going to be talking to you. There's a time in your life, and this is true for everybody who's walked this earth. There is a time in your life when you are just not in a position where you want to or are capable of hearing the good news of Jesus. There's a time when you just cannot receive what's being given to you. Times when someone shares the hope of the gospel. Wait, let's see. Sorry, hold on. Let me back up to my notes. Yeah, so there's a time when you're not capable. There are other times when you are. There are times when you have situations in your life, or, there's so many different variables what could happen, but there's times when your heart will soften, and there is a possibility of accepting Jesus. There is a possibility of hearing the good news and it actually getting in. That's what Jesus is saying, is when that happens, when I'm here telling you these things, when you have the opportunity to receive, you need to grab onto that. You need to take advantage of that. There's times when someone shares the hope of the gospel like I'm doing now. Don't ignore that. Because even though you may not be in a time when you can accept it, it may help lead you to that time. Or maybe you are in that position where you can receive. Maybe the whole reason that I'm here right now doing this video is so you can hear it in the time that you need to hear it, and God can do a work in you. Don't ignore that, because it may not come around again if you do. I'm not saying I'm going to quit, but I'm just saying those times, there's only a certain amount of them that are going to come your way. Just like there's only a certain amount of breath that you're ever going to take. At some point, you're going to take your last breath. There's no opportunity for another one. It's the same thing. The opportunity to receive Jesus, if it comes around, don't ignore it, because it may not come around again. We are exceptionally helpless to act in opposition of our hard hearts. Seeking Jesus when it's entirely up to us just isn't something that happens often, if ever. And Scripture says that. It says, "Seek me while you may find me." Essentially, and a lot of people twist this and misuse it, and God's only going to be available to me when He wants to be. That's not what it's saying. What it's saying is, there's only certain times when you're in a position where you can receive. Don't waste that. Don't ignore that. When the Bible says things like, I'm not going to try to direct quote, I didn't look this up, I don't know where it's at, but there's places in the Bible where it essentially says that God's elect, the people that will come to God, have been chosen before the foundations of time, or however it says it. That doesn't mean that God picked these certain people and those are the only ones that are going to get it. That means that God realizes, because He is everywhere all at once, He realizes that there are certain times that people are going to have, and some people are going to take advantage of it and some aren't. It doesn't mean that you can't be because He didn't choose you. It's that you won't be because you never chose Him. It's not this predestined God doesn't let you do it because He doesn't want you situation like people try to make it into. It's just the simple fact that He knows what you're going to do before you do. And that doesn't mean it's not your choice to do it. It just means He knows what decision you're going to make long before you even exist. And anyway, that gets into a deep concept that a lot of people really don't want to understand. It's not that hard to understand. People just don't want to because they want to blame God for stuff. Really what Jesus is saying is, it's on you. You're going to hear or you're not, and that's all because of the decisions you make, not because I'm making it too hard for you to understand or because I'm trying to hide anything, because these parables are simple. I mean, he's talking to people about things they know. There were farmers everywhere, and he talks to them about farming. They knew that. That would be like me talking to you today about social media. Social media. It's something that everybody gets involved in, even if they don't want to admit it or don't like it. You understand it. Jumping back in. Uh, so we're starting back in verse 18. He goes on and he says, "Now listen to the explanation of the parable about the farmers planting seeds. The seed that fell on the footpath represents those who hear the message about the kingdom and don't understand it. Then the evil one comes and snatches away the seed that was planted in their hearts." So this is someone who hears the message, or this is someone who is presented with the message, but all they want to do is hear it and argue about it, or they just don't listen to it at all. They just totally daze out and don't listen at all, and nothing gets in. They are worthless soil. I'm just gonna come right out. They're worthless as soil. Nothing can grow in them. They're not there to receive anything. They're just taking up space. They may serve a purpose, because a footpath serves a purpose, but they're not there to be. They're not the part of the farmer's ground that's going to produce and supply for the farmer or anybody else. They're just a part of it that's really not good for anything except walking on. The next, in verse 20, he says, "The seed on the rocky soil represents those who hear the message and immediately receive it with joy, but since they don't have deep roots, they don't last long. They fall away as soon as they have problems and are persecuted for believing God's word." So the rocky soil, these are the emotional people. You see them in big rallies, and you have some Christian speaker come out and he fills out a stadium or a coliseum or whatever, and he comes out and it's this big emotional hyped up thing, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but there's people there who will get totally in that moment and totally be like, yes, awesome, great, but that's all it is. It's just the feeling. And there's never any real decision to do anything about it. It's just this feeling. That's great, and I want to look into that more. And they leave there, and immediately it's gone. There's no searching for God. There's no trying to press in more. There's no trying to study or learn it. They just want that high, and they don't want the lifestyle. They just want that high. And as soon as that high wears off, or as soon as something goes bad, because people don't like Christians. If you don't believe that, then you're not doing it right, because people will act out against you if you are a Christian. I mean, in America, we've got it real easy compared to other parts of the world, but still, people treat us in different ways. I mean, I work with a whole bunch of guys who have they don't claim any Christian connection or anything like that. They don't, they're not bad guys. But they treat me different. And sometimes they treat me in a way that is openly derogatory is a strong word. But they poke fun at me because of my Christian faith sometimes. I'm not saying that because I'm mad at them or because it hurts me. I expect it. It's not a big deal. And you know what? I'm still going to keep living the life and trying to be an example to them, because someday the way I act may get through to them. So if I act poorly and I respond to that in a bad way, that's not going to do anything good for them. But people are going to treat you poorly for being a Christian. You got to expect that. But these people who are just chasing the high, they're on that high in that Coliseum situation. But then when they're in a different group who's got a different high that they're doing, then they're going to jump right into that, and there's just going to be no seriousness to them, and they're going to fall away. The seed that fell among the thorns represents those who hear God's word, but all too quickly the message is crowded out by the worries of this life and the lure of wealth, so no fruit is produced. These are the people who may really want to make a change, but they are so control freaks. This is where I've fallen in my whole life before I actually got it right. This is where I fell into. Man, I heard it my whole life, and I liked the idea, but I was so worried about the stuff that I needed to do, making some money, getting some things, I was so worried about the stuff here in this world that I needed, that I wanted, that even though I had this foundation of Christian teaching, not so much faith or understanding, but even though I had this foundation of Christian teaching, I never really connected. I was always just too worried about other stuff, and it got in the way. This is where I think the majority of people live today, because you know that old saying, if the devil can't make you bad, he'll make you busy? That's exactly what this is. These are the people who, they claim Christianity, they say that they're Christian, but they spend all of their time with work and with this thing and that thing, and the kids got sports, and the school's needing this, and my boss wants that, and we need to make more money, and it's okay if we miss church this Sunday and next Sunday or a couple times because we got to go and do some overtime or do some side jobs. And these are the people who just build up and build up and build up other things in their lives, and God is maybe an afterthought, maybe 1 or 2 Sundays a month, and maybe it's even just Easter and Christmas, and that's exactly who he's talking about here. But in verse 23, the seed that fell on good soil represents those who truly hear and understand God's word and produce a harvest of 30, 60, or even 100 times as much as had been planted. This is us. That part is the ones who really, truly get the message and listen to it and seek after it and chase after it and realize that, you know what? Yeah, you got to have money to survive. I got to pay rent. I've got to pay bills, and I've got to do these things. But you know what? The most important thing for me is that I got to spread the word. I've got to tell more people, because what I've found is so awesome that I need to share it. Not because I get anything from it. You think these seeds don't get anything from producing a great harvest? They still get used up, and they create their plant, and the plant grows and it dies. We all are going to die at some point, but their legacy carries on. That's what that harvest of 30, 60, or 100 is about. So the soil, that represents the people. That's what Jesus is telling them, is the soil is the different people. Which one are you? What soil do you want to be? Do you want to be a good producing soil? Do you want to be worthless and nothing better than for walking on? Or somewhere in between? Because I want to produce. Number one, the seeds that fall in the good soil, they have a longer life. They have a productive life. They're liked better in the long run because they provide for people. Pardon me. There's going to be a day that the life after this one is the life that I'm in, and I want that to be a good life. I want that to be a life where I have done something for the people back here, where I have left something and produced something that is good and maybe even continues on. I don't want to get to that next life and be, like, it doesn't matter if I was ever alive or not. Nobody cares, and I didn't change anything. I didn't do anything. How depressing is that idea? Next, we move on to the parable of the wheat and the weeds. Jesus says, let's see, here's another story Jesus told. The kingdom of heaven is like a farmer who planted good seed in his field. But that night, as the worker slept, his enemy came and planted weeds among the wheat, then slipped away. When the crop began to grow and produce grain, the weeds also grew. The farmer's workers went to him and said, "Sir, the field where you planted that good soil is full of weeds. Where did they come from?" "An enemy has done this," the farmer exclaimed. "Should we pull out the weeds?" they asked. "No," he replied. "You'll uproot the wheat if you do. Let both grow together until the harvest. Then I will tell the harvesters to sort out the weeds, tie them into bundles, and burn them, and put the wheat in the barn." right here, this right here, Jesus is talking about the church. He is talking about the worldwide, every congregation, everywhere that you go, every gathering of people has a potential to have this going on in it. Guess what? Not everyone who calls themselves Christians really are. Not everyone who calls themselves Christians really even wants to be. It's a popular thing today to say it, even though you're not living it, because especially, where I live in Texas and, through the Bible Belt and all that, there's a whole lot of people who claim it because it's kind of the social norm, and they have no idea. Matter of fact, I'd even go as far as to say the majority of people that claim it are not really Christians. It's just an acceptable thing to call yourself because that's what everybody calls themselves. Sometimes, though, there are double agents. Sometimes someone will call themselves Christians and implant themselves into a church for the sole purpose of trying to do the work of our enemy inside that church, to create division, to pull people away, to try and rebuff, or what's the word I'm looking for? That's not really it, but to try and dispute and to create questions and make people question their faith. I promise you, there are actual people out there whose sole purpose for going to church is to try to break the church. Period. You probably have them in your church if you go to church. I don't think we got any here. There's 3 of us. There's 3 of us, and I know the other 2 pretty well, so if it's not them, and there has to be one, I don't think it's me either. But you know what I'm saying? I mean, any group of people is going to have one, at least a potential for one, that's a dissenter. Not everyone that shows up and sits on a pew every week belongs to Jesus. Hitting your knees at the altar and sobbing emotionally doesn't mean you have changed. On Judgment Day, there are going to be fiercely religious people who are stunned to find that they never knew Jesus at all. Those are going to be people who actually thought they were what they were claiming to be, but they never really dug in and listened. They never really got close enough to what Jesus was saying to understand it. They just got close enough to the other people to say, well, this is the accepted norm. This is what I'm going to call myself. But what good does it do to cut them off? What good does it do to cut them off right now, especially? At least they're getting the opportunities to receive while they're here. Some will see their shortcomings and get it right, but they won't if we expel them. So there's 2 points here that I want to make. Jesus made 1 point with this, really. He said, if you yank up the weeds, what happens underground, if you're not familiar with plants, what happens underground is if you got a shoot sticking up like this from a plant, what you end up having is roots that have many fingers that grow out. So if you got 2 seeds that are close together, one of them's a good plant and one of them's a weed, when those roots start to grow, they may intermingle. And then you pull out the weed, what happens is it tangles with the good plant, both plants come up, and you lose the good and the bad. So what this guy is saying is if you pull up the weeds at this point, because the roots have started to form, you may end up tangling up the wheat and pulling it all out, and we may lose everything. So instead, leave it all, let it all grow. And once we get to the point that it's grown up enough that we can tell what are weeds and what are not, once it gets to the point that it's grown up enough that we can take it out at the surface, and because at the harvest, you till everything up and you get rid of all the roots anyway. So once it gets to the point that we can take what we had, our harvest, and get rid of the bad, then we're going to till out all the roots and it doesn't matter anymore. The soil's going to be turned over. And then, of course, like I was saying, is my second point is, and this doesn't really stand out in the story, doesn't really work this way in nature, but as a Christian, you have an opportunity to affect. If somebody's in your church who is not really a Christian, if somebody's in your church who's there to try to break it, you still have an opportunity to potentially affect them for the good. Now, be careful, because it's a lot easier for the bad to get in and to infect the good. But if you're on your guard and you pay attention to people and you have some discernment, you do have an opportunity to affect that person toward the good side. If you expel them and throw them out, then they have no opportunity. You've taken away that good influence. And the other side of it is, if other people don't see who they are and you throw them out, and those other people who are Christians but just aren't as discerning and think that you're doing them wrong, they may go with them. And this person isn't going to lead them into another church somewhere. They have accomplished what they wanted to do. They have destroyed the harvest. They have taken some of the good plants and destroyed them with it. I'm really thinking this is probably going to end up being at least 2, but we're going to power through. The next parable is the parable of the mustard seed. In verse 31, here's another illustration Jesus used. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed planted in a field. It is the smallest of all seeds, but it becomes the largest of garden plants. It grows into a tree, and birds come and make nests in its branches. First of all, I've had so many people come at this parable and try to debunk it with all these superficial, poor, and just arguments that look good on the surface but just don't really hold up. For example, the mustard seed is not the smallest seed. Actually, the smallest seed is a type of orchid, and I don't remember the name of it, but the smallest seed that we know is an orchid. And I believe that it even existed back then. I'm not sure. There's 2 problems. Number 1, did they actually know about that orchid in this place at this time? Did they actually know that that seed was the smallest seed known to man at this time, or that it was even smaller than the mustard seed? Because that's all we got to know is, did they know that there was a smaller seed than the mustard seed? Maybe, maybe not. The second problem is, that was neither a common plant nor one that would have carried any importance, because it didn't produce food. If you're thinking about going and eating orchids, don't. Trust me. At the very least, you're not going to get a good flavor, and at the worst, you're going to poison yourself, because at least some of the orchid family is extremely toxic. I don't know about all of it. But the whole purpose in him using the mustard seed as the well, hold on. Let me get to the other side of the argument that people try to use. The mustard plant is not a tree. It is a small plant. This is the other argument that I've had people throw at me. Well, the problem with that is that there are different types of mustard plants, some of which grow into trees. And then a little further with this argument is, well, it's not the biggest tree. It's not even a really big tree. Even the ones that grow into trees are not a real big tree. That's not what Jesus says. He says it's the biggest of garden plants. Understand the context here. What Jesus is saying is, the smallest seed that you would plant to feed yourself and other people is a mustard seed. And that tiny, tiny seed that you would put into a garden grows into a mighty tree that is capable of housing birds and other animals and providing shelter and food and all this. He's specifically referring to things that people would put work into and cultivate and understand, because that's what people were doing at the time. Again, it would be like me drawing some parallel to social media and advertising or something like that. I mean, something that you know and understand. That's what he's doing here. He's not saying it's the smallest seed that exists in the world. He's saying it's the smallest seed that is important to you, and yet is the biggest plant that you would have in your garden, a tree that you would have in your garden that would, again, be important to you. The second point here is that the mustard seed is commonly linked by people to faith the size of a mustard seed. It's another verse that another thing that Jesus said somewhere else, that if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you can tell this mountain to move and it will move. So what he's saying is if you have even the smallest amount of faith, you can still do powerful things with it. But that's not what this is about. That's not where Jesus is going with the mustard seed in this instance. He said the kingdom of heaven. The point of this parable is to point out that the kingdom of heaven walked onto earth with the birth of Jesus. Small and insignificant, born in a manger, in a barn, in a small town, whose only claim to fame was that King David was born there, and had nothing to offer from that time on to the nation of Israel. And Jesus couldn't even get a room in an inn to be born in. He was born in a barn. But he would grow into something huge, like a billion-strong movement, maybe, like the largest religious group to ever touch the face of the earth. This is what Jesus is talking about. The kingdom of heaven doesn't have to be this huge bust on the scene from the very beginning thing. It actually starts small. The way that equates to you in your own life is there may just be one little comment, one little instance, one tiny, seemingly insignificant thing to those around you that gets into your head, that gets into your heart, and just starts to grow and starts to become something else. And if you cultivate it and you allow it and you don't ignore it, like I was talking about earlier, then all of a sudden there's this opportunity for it to become the entirety of your being, to overtake everything else and to be more important than everything else. And it should be. It should be because that's what we're living for. This life is short. It's short, it's hard, it's painful, and I'm not saying I want it to be over any sooner than it's going to be, but I'm not worried about it. I'm looking forward to what happens next. You know, I'm excited about what happens next. I'm not really excited about waking up in the morning and having to go through all the, Rice Krispie body stuff, snap, crackle, and pop getting out of bed. But I am excited for the day when that doesn't happen anymore. When I have a new body and it's perfected, and I mean, I've pretty much got this one as good as it can get. But when I have a new body that's perfected, and I don't have that stuff happening, old age doesn't affect me anymore. I am living for eternity, not for here. I'm doing here what I can do to get everybody else to that eternity. Then we get into the parable of the yeast. Jesus also used this illustration. The kingdom of heaven is like the yeast a woman used in making bread. Even though she put only a little yeast in, back up a sec. Even though she only put a little yeast in 3 measures of flour, it permeated every part of the dough. Here again, Jesus pointing out that a little pebble tossed into water can cause ripples across the entire surface of the water. I do parables too. But what he's saying is, like I just said, that little bit of yeast gets in and affects the entirety of your being, the entirety of your family, the entirety of your community. Depending on how much you feed it, it can go on forever. There's a principle in making bread, and it's you may have to help me out with this if you know it. You make it's a little batter or dough, or I don't know, but basically it's, oh my goodness, this word's going to come to me at like 3 o'clock in the morning, and I'm going to wake up. But anyway, whatever it's called, I can't remember. You take this little portion of bread making material, of basically dough, and instead of using that to make dough, you take a little pinch of that and you put it into all the new ingredients and you make new dough. But that bread, or that dough, creates the flavors and all the stuff in this new batch of dough. So basically you're using that little piece of bread or that little piece of dough and the yeast in it and the flavorings in it and all that stuff, and it can go on forever. Now you could take that and bake it and make make a good batch of bread, or You can take a little pinch of that. Well, let me carry on with that. You can make a good batch of bread, feed yourself, maybe feed your family. Or you can take that and take your little pinch and you make your dough and you feed yourself and you feed your family. Then take another little pinch and you make some more dough and you feed some other people in your neighborhood. And then you take another pinch and you make some more dough and you feed some more people. And you can literally make that last essentially forever. As long as you've got some of that, you can continue to make from that same batch. That legacy of that batch of dough can carry on for years, decades even. Sorry, I got a little excited, got a little out here, and so now I'm trying to reel it back in. Give me a second. Starting back in verse 34. So then Matthew says, Jesus always used stories and illustrations like these when speaking to the crowds. In fact, he never spoke to them without using such parables. This is why I was saying that this may not all have happened at one point, because Matthew says he never spoke to the people without using parables. So these may be a collection from all different times. It doesn't really matter. This fulfilled what God had spoken through the prophet. I will speak to you in parables. I will explain things hidden since the creation of the world. Then we move into the parable of the wheat and weeds explained. I think I kind of already did that. Sorry, I jumped ahead and told you, and then now we're going back to it in Scripture. But Jesus is going to tell them now. Then, leaving the crowds outside, Jesus went into the house. His disciples said, "Please explain to us the story of the weeds in the field." Jesus replied, The Son of Man is the farmer who plants the good seed. The field is the world, and the good seed represents the people of the kingdom. The weeds are the people who belong to the evil one. The enemy who planted the weeds among the wheat is the devil. The harvest is the end of the world, and the harvesters are the angels. Just as the weeds are sorted out and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the world. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will remove from his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. And the angels, and the angels will throw them into the fiery furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in their Father's kingdom. Anyone with ears to hear should listen and understand. So, I was talking earlier about that there's people, even in your church, who are not good Christians and who are the weeds. That doesn't mean that it's your job to get rid of the weeds. Because he says right here, the harvesters are the angels. So don't overstep your bounds. It's not your job to determine who's good and who's bad, or who's worth saving and who's not. Our job is to produce fruit. Our job is to produce food, and if these people take it in and are changed, great. If they don't, that's not our problem to deal with. Then we go into the parable of the hidden treasure and the pearl. In 44, Jesus starts teaching, the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure that a man discovered hidden in a field. In his excitement, he hid it again and sold everything he owns to get enough money to buy the field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant on the lookout for choice pearls. When he discovered a pearl of great value, he sold everything he owned and bought it. I'll tell you right now that Jesus is the best decision that I have ever made. I have an amazing wife. I've got great kids. I have made, in my estimation, a lot of really good decisions and had a lot of really good opportunities. I've made a lot of really stupid, bad decisions too, but that's not what we're talking about right now. There are things that I would not, for the life of me, change because the decisions I made produced such amazing results. None of them come close to the decision to accept Jesus. I gave him my entire life. I held nothing back. Whatever he wanted to take away or change was his to do with as he wished, and I have given him that authority every day since. Every day I start my day with the understanding, generally by saying it, but if not saying it, with the understanding, Jesus, whatever you don't like, get rid of it. I've had jobs go away because it wasn't where I needed to be at the time. I've had people leave my life because they didn't need to be there. And a lot of these were not necessarily decisions I made. Especially the people in my life that left. Usually not a decision I made. It was a decision they made, but I gave Jesus the authority, and he took advantage of it. Life with him is far greater than anything I could have ever built on my own. The reason I say that is because I did that. What these guys here did. Guy found a treasure in a field and realized that it was so important that everything else he had was expendable so that he could have that treasure. The guy with the pearl realized that pearl was so valuable that everything else he had was expendable because he had to have that pearl. Another thing that I want to point out here is that the guy who told you, car show. The guy who found the treasure in the field could have just taken the treasure from the field. But would that have been right? It would have belonged to someone else. So instead, what he did is put it back, and then he went and got it the right way. You cannot steal your way into heaven. I hear about people. I had a person in my life for a long time who just had no interest in Jesus and no interest in the gospel, none of that. And of course, at that time of my life, I really didn't either. But he always said, he's like, I'm just going to live how I want to. I'm going to believe what I want to. And then on my deathbed, I'll just accept Jesus and I'll be all good and I'll be okay. The problem with that is that the attitude's wrong. This guy in this field could have taken that treasure. He could have lived off of it and, had that money and all that stuff without ever doing the right thing. And he might have had a decent life, or he might have got caught. And that same attitude, it's that attitude that's the problem. We know that, like the sinner on the cross, he accepted Jesus, and Jesus said, I will honor that. And I have no doubt that man was saved. But someone who's like, I'll just do this as a little cover my behind kind of thing at the end, well, that's not a real decision. It's not an acceptance of Jesus. It's trying to steal your way into heaven. Next, we go on to the parable of the fishing net. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a fishing net that was thrown out into the water and caught fish of every kind. When the net was full, they dragged it up onto the shore, sat down, and sorted the good fish into crates, but threw the bad ones away. This is the way it will be at the end of the world. The angels will come and separate the wicked people from the righteous, throwing the wicked into the fiery furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Do you understand all these things? Again, not our job to deal with it. We're just the other fish. So, the net's cast, swim into it, and if you can get other people to come into it, bring them. And if they're not the ones they need to be, that's not your job. Your job is bring people along, period. Yes, they said, we do. Because he just asked them if they understood. They said, yes, we do. Then he added, every teacher of religious law who becomes a disciple in the kingdom of heaven is like a homeowner who brings from his storeroom new gems of truth as well as old. Sorry. And then the next section is Jesus rejected at Nazareth. We've come to the end of Matthew's recording of this particular set of recording of parables, but I left this in because I thought it was important. And and you'll understand. So going into verse 53, when Jesus had finished telling these stories and illustrations, he left that part of the country. He returned to Nazareth, Jesus of Nazareth, returned home, his hometown. When he taught there in the synagogues, everyone was amazed and said, "Where does he get this wisdom and the power to do miracles?" Then they scoffed. "He's just the carpenter's son. And we know Mary, his mother, and his brothers, James and Joseph, Simon and Judas. All his sisters live right here among us. Where did he learn all these things?" And they were deeply offended and refused to believe in him. Then Jesus told them, "A prophet is honored anywhere except in his own hometown and among his own family." And so he did only a few miracles there because of their unbelief. The last part is not usually included, like I said, but I left it in because not everyone is going to accept the gospel from you. Sometimes it will even be the people closest to you, the ones who should accept it, the ones who should see a difference in you. But you're not alone. Even Jesus couldn't escape his ordinary past. If he was marginalized by people close to him, why in the world would we be surprised when we are? In my experience, what has happened to me, even with some very important people who kind of had an opportunity to control my path, when I accepted Jesus, people knew too much about who I had been and were not willing to see who I was and who I was becoming now. And that's going to happen. Even though people will see, if they will pay attention, a difference in you. And sometimes they don't have to pay that much attention. Some people can, strangers that I run into and stuff now, they can just tell. They just know there's something different about me than them. And that's cool. That's awesome. But the people close to me, particularly the religious people close to me, unfortunately, were very biased toward me. So when I tried to follow the path toward getting credentialed as a minister, some of the people whose job it was to get me to the point where I accepted Jesus and became a real Christian, some of those people would not allow me to take the next step in the ministry because I knew my past and they were unwilling to see my present and they were unwilling to look at my future. You're going to have to accept that people who know who you were are going to be very resistant to seeing who you have become, who you are becoming, and the future you've chosen. Oftentimes, it's those closest to us that just can't let us be different. Don't be discouraged by that, because even Jesus couldn't be as effective in his hometown as he was everywhere else. And these are the people who were supposed to be closest to him and love him the most, and probably did love him the most. But they just couldn't get past, well, he's just a kid. We saw him grow up. He's just an ordinary guy. Whereas people who had never met him before, they didn't have that baggage. They didn't have that history. He wasn't so common to them because all they knew was wisdom and power and miracles. They didn't know the, little boy who maybe was involved in a group who broke their window with a baseball or, whatever. It was easier for them than it is for, so just don't be upset. Don't be discouraged when the people close to you just don't want to accept that you've changed, or just maybe don't believe it. It may take a little more time and it may never happen, but that doesn't mean that it's not real. That is the third big speech of Jesus, or at least the way that Matthew records it. And like I said, I love the parables. I love the fact that he puts things into wording that the people would understand. And that's what we do as preachers a lot, is just try to take what we know from today, what we know that you're familiar with, and use that to illustrate the points that Jesus was illustrating with the things that these people were familiar with. I really don't know how I'm going to land the plane today, so I guess I'm just going to cut it off. I appreciate you listening.